So what are the core ethical principles that determine research protocols? Well, these core ethical principles were laid down in the Belmont Report of the 70s. The Belmont Report stands on three main pillars. The first one is the respect for persons, the second one is the beneficence, and the third one is justice. Let's go through each of them individually. The first pillar suggests that there should be respect for persons who are participating in the experiment. Primary in this aspect is the fact that individual participants should be treated as an autonomous agents. They should have the autonomy to say yes or no and to the decisions that they are making in the context of the experiment. Second, there should be protection for those with diminished autonomy, and we will see what that means. Third, there should be a right to make informed decisions, and this informed decision must be reflected in the consent form that must be provided to an individual participant at the very beginning of the research study. The second key pillar of the Belmont Report is beneficence. Beneficence fundamentally says that do not do any harm to a participant. Another way of thinking about beneficence is that you want to maximize benefits while at the same time minimize risks. It's very important to understand that it's primarily the researcher who will benefit from a research study. A researcher will publish a paper that will lead to career advancements. For the scientific community, there is much benefit to be had for the knowledge that is produced as part of the research. However, the risk often is borne by the participants, despite the fact that there are some other forms of compensations that are sometimes given out. Now, beneficence means that you want to maximize these benefits, but at the same time keep in mind that the risk to the participants must be minimized. And this risk benefit assessment is what needs to be independently evaluated by an institutional review board. The third key pillar of experimental ethics is justice. What it says is there should be a fair distributions of the benefits and the burdens. There should be equal treatment of all participants, and there should be no exploitation of vulnerable populations. The Belmont Report, as I mentioned earlier, was published in 1979 and forms the foundation of modern research ethics. As we have been discussing, the participants must have full informed consent before they go on to respond to the questions in a research study. In this informed consent, the following are the required elements. The informed consent text must clearly write down the purpose of the research, how long the research will last, what are the procedures involved in the research process, the risks and discomforts that may emerge from the research process, and the potential benefits that may result from the research. It is also important to know that the required elements also contain the confidentiality measures. A lot of times the responses that are gathered from participants, they contain non-anonymous information. It is important for the respondents to know whether the non-anonymous information will be anonymized before the research analysis, or if they will be stored in a manner that is safe and confidential. If relevant, required elements must also contain information about compensation. And as many of you know by now, all experiments in economics necessarily has a compensation part. This compensation part must be clearly laid down in the informed consent form. It is also important to state that participation in the experiment is entirely voluntary and that a participant has a right to withdraw at any point in time during the experiment. Second, there must be special considerations for human subject research so far as researchers are concerned. For example, researchers must make sure that minors are made to participate in an experiment only after a thorough parental consent and a child assent. There are other non-minor vulnerable populations with certain kind of disability, populations that belong to marginalized communities. Depending on how to what extent the IRB thinks the population is vulnerable, the experimental protocol must clearly lay down extra layers of protections for such population. Third, in economics, as we have been mentioning throughout the course, deception is not allowed in experimental research. By deception, one means giving an information that is objectively false or untrue. As economists, we cannot give information that is false or untrue. A dominant norm in the discipline has evolved that prevents us from deceiving our experimental participants. But if under extreme condition you were to deploy deception as part of an experimental protocol, you must suitably debrief the experimental participants. This is something that is done in other subjects such as psychology and other applications in business science. However, if you want to do this, you should definitely consider debriefing the participants and you should keep the IRB informed that deception is being used. Once again, if you are interested in economics as a discipline or to contribute to the knowledge of economics, then deception means that your research will not receive the credibility that it should. Fourth and finally, in online research, the digital consent form replaces the physical consent form. And given that many of you are probably going to conduct online research or research with participants joining the experimental platform online, you will probably make use of the digital consent forms. It's important to remember at the same time that consent is ongoing. It's not a one-time thing. It is relevant as long as the experiment is under progress. It is also useful for researchers to understand how the institutional review boards are formed so that you as a researcher is better able to approach the institutional review board with your research question and the ethics protocol. First and foremost, what is the purpose and composition of the IRBs? The IRBs are supposed to protect human subjects from harm. It has a minimum of 5 members, and these members are mostly scientists and non-scientists along with other members of the community. These are all reputed members of the community who have gone and engaged with the ethics of experiments for a reasonably long time, and IRB feels that these members will be able to evaluate the research protocol independently and objectively. The task of this board, which may contain a minimum of 5 members, will be to review all research that involves human subject. Now, when this committee has thoroughly reviewed all the research that involves human subject, what are the review categories that the board can recommend for a particular research? Well, the following are the 3 main review categories where your study may be relegated. The IRB may end up saying that the study is completely exempt from the IRB review process. That happens for very few studies and only in studies where there is minimal risk. In educational settings, surveys for example, they consider studies conducted have very minimal risk. Most of these studies are then given an exemption from a full review. The second category which the board can recommend for your study is no more than a minimal risk, in which case there is an expedited review process. This expedited review process means that the review board or a subset of the review board, as determined by the chair of the board, will quickly give you a yes or no and ask for minimum modification to your research protocol. Finally, the review board can also give you a full review, in which case they assess that the risk associated with this research is greater than the minimal risk. Most of the studies in economics fall under exempt or expedited review, but you should be prepared to face the full board if the IRB requires or thinks that it is important for your research to be evaluated by the full board. Next, so what are the submission requirements to an IRB? Well, first and foremost, as a researcher, you have to fill out a detailed IRB form. This IRB form will note down the research protocol and clearly lay down the methodology which you are using for your research. This consent form and the recruitment materials should be made available as part of the IRB application packet. Nowadays, oftentimes, no physical posters or flyers are used, but there is extensive online canvassing for recruitment purposes. Now, this risk-benefit analysis should also be part of your initial application for IRB. You should be able to independently tell the board what in your assessment is the risk and benefit of the research study. And finally, you should also give a clear data protection plan. If you plan to keep the data in an online folder in a cloud service, then who has access to that cloud service? What are the preventive measures that are being taken by the cloud service to make sure that the research data will not be leaked? These are information that the IRB may seek from you. A very important part of modern research practices is data management, simply because the volume of data has increased by leaps and bounds. It is important to note down in the IRB application how you wish to anonymize or de-identify data, if at all you intend to. If you do not intend to anonymize or de-identify the data, there should be a clear reason why the research question demands a protocol where you cannot anonymize or de-identify the data. The data management also requires you to securely store and password protect the data, and there should be clear policies related to to what extent the data will be retained and whether it will be destroyed after the publication process. As we have been talking about, the vulnerable populations need special attention and additional safeguards. These vulnerable populations could be children, they could be prisoners, they could be pregnant women. They could also be cognitively impaired individuals or economically and educationally disadvantaged groups of population. However, it's important to be cognizant of these vulnerabilities and make sure that the experimental protocol takes into consideration the vulnerabilities of such populations before rolling out the experiment. It is important at the very end of the day to learn that ethics is an ongoing responsibility for the researcher. Any report that adversely affects, any event that adversely affects individuals should be immediately reported to the review board. If a research continues for more than a year, there should be annual review of the research by the board, and it is important that any changes in longitudinal studies that may have been implemented by the researcher is brought to the notice of the board, and a suitable corrigendum or a correction form is deployed and the board is kept informed. The researchers must maintain accurate records for a minimum of 3 years and publish the results of the research responsibly. At the end of the day, the researcher cares most about the results that emerge from their study, but there is a whole range of things that a researcher must be careful about and cognizant of, and the most important of that is the ethical considerations for participants of experimental research.